Hello, everyone, and I am sufficiently blinded, so I assume that I've heard clapping, so I assume there are people out there. Thanks for the kind introduction. It's really great to be here again, and it's always a delight to meet and socialize with other thought leaders and like-minded people in the industry. And so today my topic is the future of global opportunities in renewable markets. So I'll kind of meander all over the place, and I hope we have a chance for a question or two at the end. So I'll start with the problem statement, and I'll say that in my view, the future of global opportunities in renewable markets is fair to good. Now, of course, a caveat there, it depends on the continuum of time. I think in the short term, it's probably more fair, longer term, more good to very good. But in sum total, I think fair to good. And I'll close with that same statement to some degree. So I'll talk about basically what everyone here knows already. It's sort of the current model versus the future model of a new generation in this case. And so when I say generation, I cover utility scale generation, renewable generation, and also distributed generation / microgrids in some cases. But essentially, the model is changing. And so in my view, a premise to the future is going to be companies and entities shifting to a more flexible, in most cases, decentralized model as fast as the U.S. Energy market has switched over the years. But essentially, you go from a vertically integrated model to a model where you can go in and out of almost every facet of the chain, probably with the exception, for the most part, in transmission. But again, that's a function of at what generation or what voltage level you count transmission. But essentially, it encompasses everything from energy management, demand response, to your typical suite of renewable utility scale generation products, all the way to back office systems, microgrid systems, even on-site storage. So in the context of my comments, keep in mind that I'm generally referring to this notion that switching to this new model will be one of the catalysts in terms of moving more towards what I think is a fair to good and even good to very good global market for renewables in the future. So also another slide here that's a source of Bloomberg New Energy Finance. It's the convergence of grid parity compared to gas and coal. And so if you take 4 big segments around the globe, the EU countries, the US, China, and India, you'll see that there's a definite pattern of convergence of utility scale renewables, wind and solar, compared to gas and coal. If you go to the bottom right of that chart, you'll see that the convergence happens quite a bit faster in India. And I'll talk on my next slide about, I think, why that's important, and even to some degree China, if you couple that with demand growth in the world. But as grid parity converges, you'll obviously see more and more opportunities for renewables to prosper globally. I'll also say that this chart depicts this convergence devoid of subsidy. So that's important. I think if you add various levels of subsidies, whether they be feed-in tariffs or versions of production tax credits, investment tax credits, the convergence is likely to happen sooner. And if you add a commitment to some of the discussions and goals that were agreed to in the recent Paris discussions, there could be some factors out there that make this convergence happen a bit faster going forward. And then, of course, maybe on the downside, a driver is continued lower natural gas prices, which obviously puts pressure on the parity aspects of wind and solar especially. Next slide is somewhat comprehensive. On the left side, it looks at 2 bar charts that basically suggest that's very intuitive, that the growth is going to be forecast globally in the non-OECD countries, i.e. the developing and even frontier world. And obviously that's where the population is, and that's where the gains are to be made in terms of electrification of of communities, especially if you look at India, Africa, where you still have a considerable amount of the population that doesn't have electricity. I mean, think about that. So in India, for example, I think the last stat I heard was there were upwards of 350 million people who did not have power. And that's not sustained power, that's not no power at all. And you think about that being greater than the population of the United States, you do see the opportunities there. The chart on the right depicts graphically the demand growth around the globe. And I'll start at the left. You can see in Canada, that's red, generally negative growth. A lot of this is driven by what's happening out west in the Alberta province, especially with the decline in oil prices and less production in the oil sands region. And generally, Western Canada, to some degree, drives the energy economics of the entire country. But you see an incredible decrease in demand, in some respects driven a lot by the reduction in industrial demand in the western parts of Canada. As you look at the United States, demand growth is low. Of course, it certainly depends on what region you're in, but generally as you have the convergence of energy management, conservation, and economic forces, i.e. Low growth, low inflation, although the unemployment levels are getting back to historical levels, the job participation rate is still fairly low, or high rather. So you see some dynamics in the United States that would suggest broadly that the demand growth is low. If you go below that and look at Africa, Brazil, South America and Brazil, bolded in the outline, across the country in general, there's projected to be medium growth. And ironically, if you look at Brazil, that country possesses some of the greatest natural resources in terms of wind regimes and irradiation regimes. Some of the highest capacity factors in the world are on the west coast of Brazil, in Bahia State, for example, where you get capacity factors upwards of 52% for wind, and you get higher radiation levels too. So South America in totality is somewhat promising. Now, obviously in Brazil, besides the downside being political, you do have a scarcity of availability of capital in that country, and you also have the exchange rate risk, which has, to some degree, prohibited outside investment from taking advantage of those great natural resources. But if you take away those factors, mid to long term, Brazil looks very promising, mainly because of the medium to good demand. If you go to the right of that and you look at Africa, broadly green again, but dark green in some places. West Africa, I think Ghana might be the little anomaly there that's red. Even if you look at the coast there, Botswana, Namibia, South Africa, and the like, up to the right, Nigeria, broadly, a whole lot of growth in Africa. So another place where you're going to see, I think, renewables prosper. My sense would be, though, that in these places in Africa, you're probably going to see distributed generation, microgrids, more so than utility scale generation. I think, obviously, a lot of these countries see that they can be analogs to the telecom industry, where you skip a generation of spend on infrastructure, you go right from nothing. You know, like countries went from nothing to a cell phone. They skipped the landline stop. You're going to see, I think, a lot of these countries, especially Africa, skip the infrastructure of transmission, some heavy aspects of distribution, substations, and go right to distributed generation, and then go back later as they grow and develop and connect other facets of that infrastructure. So tremendous opportunity there. If you go generally to the right, the dark green area is India, and really an incredible opportunity there. You have great growth in terms of population, but also in terms of electrification of the country. You also have a dynamic of India being a net importer of commodities, so low oil prices helps disposable income in that country, and commodity prices are also very low too. And you've got a very progressive and dynamic prime minister who set a goal of, I think it's 100 gigawatts of solar by 2022, and I think 40 gigawatts of that will be rooftop, and something like 75 gigawatts of wind in the same time period. Now, I doubt that they'll reach those numbers, but to even set that as a target is incredible, and I think will spur a lot of growth and opportunity. So India is really a bright bulb in this dynamic, and will be likely the driver in the global fortunes of renewable energy broadly. Of course, to the right of India, upright is China. Above that, Russia and some of other parts of Europe, negative growth. Left of India, the other kind of dark green area is Afghanistan, actually, I think. Pakistan's got a little bit of growth. But obviously, as I talk through these, the broad specter of growth is going to be impacted by a lot of things. Obviously, physical security, cybersecurity in some cases, exchange rate, currency risks, all those things are going to be impacted. Additionally, I talked about the availability and low price of natural gas too. So although I'm identifying areas that I think are promising, I keep making the caveat that that's sort of in a vacuum. When you overlay all these other factors, it'll determine whether or not that seems to be a place that's going to attract investment and then, i.e., growth. But anyways, that's generally where it looks around the world. Some really promising areas, and I think in some totality, offers the prospects of global renewable energy growth in a way that I think will be very rewarding to some degree. This last slide is the depiction of microgrids, and I isolate that because I think in the United States and some parts of the developed world, I think microgrids will become more and more available and a part of the equation as you have this convergence of low lithium prices, and you also have things like vanadium flow batteries and other battery sources that are beginning to be scalable. And lots of companies and communities are actually sort of bench testing batteries in solar farms and the like. So you're starting to get more information in a way that will allow that to be much more viable. But this is just kind of a depiction of the aspects of an urban schematic of an urban microgrid situation where you've got wind, solar, you've got batteries, you've got electric vehicles. In some cases, combined heat and power is the baseload source for the microgrid, in addition to batteries. So lots of variability there, but I think you're starting to see convergence of pricing and availability. So there could be college campuses, places along each coast that have generally higher prices. I think in South America, you have opportunities with remote mining operations. In India alone, for example, there's over 100 gigawatts of backup diesel generation. So tremendous opportunities for microgrids and or batteries. But I think this might be the emerging opportunity, I think, in the United States in the short term. So I'm looking at my timer here, and I am on 7 seconds. So with that, I'll wrap. This is my last slide, but I'll go back to the notion that for those reasons, I believe, in general, it's fair to good globally, very good in some markets to excellent like India, but I think long term, as there's more convergence and coalescence around the notion to impact carbon globally, the outlook is going to be good to very good. Thank you.
So I guess my two quick questions. First, so we miss you at CPS Energy, but we're thrilled with your replacement, Paula Gold-Williams, who, if you don't mind, yes, Paula is here. We're so honored to have you here. What's something that you learned in San Antonio that you're about to bring to the whole world?
Oh, boy, that's a deep question. I think a couple things. One is I think to some degree, we learned that it's okay to be, to some degree, on the leading edge and to be the first to step out there. As you recall, yes, we stepped out there big with a 400-megawatt solar RFP back in 2012. And trust me, for a guy coming from the old state world of investor-owned utilities, where your goal was always to be fifth in line to try something first, that was really stepping out there. Yeah. So I think to some degree, it's safe to go on the water, was one of the things I've learned. And so I think as you look globally, especially with distributed generation, it's going to take some risk and some boldness to step out there. And I think it's safer than I would have thought back in 2011.
I guess my next question to that would be looking at distributed generation and what's been happening in India this week. Certainly it's a ripe area for electrification growth. load growth in that area. But the microgrids that are popping up everywhere feel like a very different notion of microgrid than the United States. What can you sort of impart on us on sort of what the face and shape of that distributed generation story looks like in places like India, Tanzania, and all these other places that are really investing in this?
I think there are two models, right? So I think there's one model that I suggested. I think Africa will have its sort of own model, and that model will be generally using distributed generation to skip a generation of infrastructure spend. So the distributed generation might just look like solar panels, right? But not connected to substations. And that's kind of the demarcation, right? So if they're connected to substation, they almost become utility scale. So I think you'll see that, where you'll see solar panels, maybe small batteries, but mostly solar, and it'll be hundreds of miles to the next transmission line.
Yeah.
And if those places have power just while the sun's shining, that's great, right? It's better than nothing. Yeah. So that's a model that will then grow. In India, the model is likely to me to be more your traditional battery storage. I mentioned the 100 gigawatts of backup diesel generation. To me, it's ripe for scalable battery storage.
Solar after dark.
Yep, that's an option. So I think those would be the two prevailing models. Now, to your first question, what distinguishes them from the United States and some other places, they won't have all the other pieces of combined heat and power, energy,
stranded assets. Some of these things that are too connected, and you end up losing the value down the next generation of technology, right?
So I think you'll see a simplified version compared to what, when you think of microgrids in the United States, it'll be close to that.
Yeah.
Where you have combined heat and power, you have energy management, and all those things. I don't think you'll see that in the developing world for quite a while. And quite frankly, it's not necessary.
What Doyle's brought to FPL, what he brought to consumers, what he brought to Exelon, what he brought to CPS, he's now bringing to the whole world. And for that, we named him our 2016 ETS Thought Leader of the Year. Thank you for empowering places in the dark.
Thank you.
Appreciate it, sir.